I took a risk yesterday. I Googled, why do Jews? And let the robots fill in the rest. Turns out your average Googler is very curious about Jewish law. They want to know why we don't eat pork, and why we circumcise our sons, and why we sometimes wear GoPros on our heads when we pray. Side note, not GoPros. They all point to something that Jews wonder all the time. Why do we have so many rules? Now, I'm not an expert in other religions, but from what I can tell, most don't have quite as many rules as we do. I mean, basically every religion has some variant on don't be a jerk. Most have some extra rules on top of that. No caffeine for the Mormons, no alcohol for the Muslims, strict nonviolence for the Jains, you get it. But if you're looking for a religious system with rules for the most nitty-gritty, seemingly random things, I think Judaism takes the cake. To make things even more complicated, the rules of Judaism aren't based on a literal reading of the Torah. Ever heard of an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth? Yeah, that's a metaphor. We don't literally yank out people's teeth in the name of justice.
Well, obviously, it's not meant to be taken literally.
That's because ancient rabbis clarified, amended, and even added to the rules of the Bible. The result is a system of laws known as halacha, which translates literally to the path one walks. But let's be honest, sometimes it's less of a path and more like hiking Everest. Some of the rules of Judaism make intuitive sense to us. You know, like don't murder anyone. Others, like don't eat shrimp, aren't as immediately clear. But let's zoom out for a second, because I'm not just asking why we're not allowed to take advantage of the budget surf and turf at Red Lobster. I'm really asking, why does God care about what we eat or how we dress? Turns out I'm not the first person to wonder why God gave us such a lengthy to-do list. Maimonides, i.e. the biggest name in Judaism since Moses, asked the very same question. After all, he says, God is infinite and omnipotent. What could an all-powerful force possibly need from a bunch of puny mortals like us? Turns out, nothing. Maimonides tells us that the rules aren't actually for God's benefit. The point of them isn't to make God happy or proud like a parent at their kid's first piano recital. God is way beyond our human capacity to understand. No, the rules are for us, God's way of bringing us closer to the divine. So we don't do them because we want God to be happy and reward us like a kid doing chores so he can get his allowance. And we don't do them because we're afraid of, being dangled over a lake of fire for eternity. Instead, we perform these rituals and follow these rules no matter how unintuitive they appear to us because we love God. And following these rules bring us closer to the divine, which sounds, it sounds mildly terrifying. Even after reading Maimonides, I still didn't fully get how you can get closer to God by, say, giving your new dishes a bath before you use them. Yep, that's a rule. Before we can use our new dishes for the first time, we dip them in a ritual bath full of rainwater. And then we take them back home, stick them in the dishwasher, sanitize the heck out of them, because rainwater's gross. But as a wise man once said, there is nothing new under the sun. King Solomon, the wise man was King Solomon. Yet again, I'm not the first one to wonder about the logic of following rules equals closeness to God. Rabbi Shimson Raphael Hirsch, who was one of the MVPs of Orthodox Judaism, asked this question too. But the difference between him and I is that he also had an answer to this question. Rabbi Hirsch wrote that, sure, sometimes halacha seems, for lack of a better term, a little weird. And sure, we're humans, we mess up a lot. But the goal isn't to fully understand and rationalize every single rule or to follow each one perfectly without any slip-ups. Nope, the goal is a lot simpler than that. Following halacha helps us dedicate ourselves to God. So this made a lot more sense to me than this abstract idea of closeness with God, because I was able to put it into terms that made sense to me. We all have relationships, right? Parents, kids, friends, romantic partners, even our pets. Our lives are structured around our relationships. Let's be honest, no matter if they're platonic, parental, or romantic, relationships aren't always easy. They aren't always fun. But when we love someone, we show up for them. We do things for them, no matter what, even if it doesn't make sense to us, even if it's inconvenient. Because that's the essence of commitment, making the intentional choice to invest over and over, even when we don't necessarily connect to what they want. Halacha is our very practical, concrete way of committing ourselves to God, even when we're not totally sure why God has asked us to, give our fields a rest every 7 years. That's why we have rules around everything in our lives, from the way we dress, to the way we eat, to the way we raise our kids. Keeping halacha to the best of our ability is an act of dedication, the kind of sacrifice you're happy to make because that's what it means to love someone. Look, it's like any relationship. Yeah, it takes work, but it's also rewarding. The same is true for observant Jews who follow halacha. It's not always easy, but it's worth it. Maybe you've heard of the Talmud, which is basically a compilation of hundreds of years of rabbis arguing about the correct interpretation of Judaism. Well, the Talmud has plenty to say on halacha, since that's where so much of halacha comes from. One of the rabbis suggests that keeping halacha is sort of like creating a force field around yourself, a personal sphere that wards off negative traits like apathy or selfishness. By following a ton of very structured rules, we build a boundary between us and the rest of the world. In the 21st century, we'd call that living with intention. So the Talmud was way ahead of its time in suggesting that following this sort of super structured approach to life helps us to remain mindful, intentional, and aware of God all the time, even when we're doing something mundane and physical. Halacha even helps us elevate the mundane and the physical, turning everyday actions into something holy. Like a lot of religions, Judaism has some very complex rules around eating, which makes perfect sense, I guess, when you think about it. Eating is the most mundane act there is. It's a biological necessity. We're programmed to do it, sometimes to excess. But eating is also transcendent. It's a social ritual, a way to welcome guests and build a community. Jewish rules around food, like the fact that we make a blessing before and after we eat, remind us that we're not just performing a basic function. We're recognizing God as the source of all sustenance, both physical and spiritual. And when we're full, we say, hey, thanks. In our most mundane and human moments, we're making space for the divine. And that is why Judaism has so many rules and rituals. If you're an observant Jew who follows all of these very specific rules, it's kind of impossible to not constantly be reminded of the presence of God. There's something very comforting about being raised in a tradition that emphasizes structured decision-making. Think about it like this. Let's say your parents raised you vegetarian, so as a kid, you don't really think about it. That's just your life. But later, when you grow up, you have the choice to remain vegetarian or to start eating meat. Some people in this scenario do break with their traditions, but lots of others keep making the choices that were ingrained in them from childhood, not because they have to, but because they want to. They want to live their lives according to the value system that their parents instilled in them from birth. That's kind of what halacha is like, a system of decision-making that helps to condition us to make the most spiritually fulfilling choices we can. At the same time, halacha is a living system, not a fossil. Yeah, Judaism is rooted in ancient traditions, but our ancient ancestors likely wouldn't recognize many aspects of today's Jewish practice. Everything evolves. And that includes religion. The Torah has a lot of rules about animal sacrifices in the Holy Temple. But in case you're scratching your head like, wait, what? Jews do animal sacrifices? Did I miss that part in Joey's bar mitzvah? The answer is no, we don't. The Holy Temple hasn't existed for about 2,000 years, which means the rules around animal sacrifices aren't super relevant to us today. Instead of sacrificing animals in the temple, we pray 3 times a day, which, to be honest, I prefer. Significantly less blood. Halacha adapts with every historical moment, every technological advance, every external or existential threat. And like most things, it's a product of its time. And each of its evolutions tells us something about the wider social and historical context, painting a fascinating picture of a living religion. Today's rabbis make halachic rulings around things that our ancestors couldn't have dreamed of. We got lab-grown meat, artificial intelligence, surrogacy. But they're not just pulling these rulings out of a black hat. True, there was no such thing as in vitro fertilization in the days of the Talmud, but the Talmud does give us thousands of years worth of arguments and precedents for modern halachic rulings. And because it's basically a record of hundreds of years of arguments, it also gives us permission to disagree with one another on the ideal way to do things. So sure, all mainstream Jewish movements agree on basic things, and all observant Jews operate within the same halachic framework. But within that framework, we're all kind of doing our own thing. It's not exactly a free-for-all, but it is super individualized. Halacha tells us we have to have a Passover Seder. Cool, but what does that look like? Around the world, Jewish communities put their own spin on this basic instruction. Some communities reenact the splitting of the Red Sea by pouring water on the floor. Others beat each other lightly with scallions to recall the pain of enslavement. I could go on, but you get it. None of these customs are more or less halachic. They're just different interpretations of the same rule, rooted in a specific cultural or social context. And that's why some Jews dress like this and others dress like this. Our dress, our worship, our particular ritual quirks, they all point to our membership in a specific sub-community within the larger Jewish family. The whole framework teaches us to think, to be mindful, and to find meaning in everything we do. And to me, that's a pretty good reason to follow the rules.